I don't know about you, but in these unsettled times, I find myself asking searching questions that I thought I'd answered. What kind of person am I called to be in times like these? What am I called to do? What does it mean to be a person of faith, a Christian, a follower of Christ? What should that look like? What should my life look like? What are the priorities, the commitments, the guiding themes of such a life? The answers to those questions will be somewhat different for each of us, but I have to say, just asking them often leaves me feeling inadequate and facing even more questions. Am I up to that challenge? Can I be that person? And does it even matter? Can I really make a difference in a world that seems to be so full of anger, division, fear, and the willingness to believe anything to support one's own self-serving agenda? How can I be sure that I'm not just doing the same thing? At that point in my internal dialogue, I'm about ready just to go to Zillow.com and start looking for property in Canada. But I usually have to write a sermon, so I turn to the scriptures instead, and almost always find unexpected encouragement and grace to help me go on. This week, for example, I heard these words: I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come? My help comes from God, who made heaven and earth. God said to me, O mortal, stand up on your feet, and I will speak with you. And when the Holy One spoke to me, a spirit entered into me and set me on my feet. And I heard God speaking to me. God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. It's like some kind of koan we have to meditate upon. Jesus called the 12 and began to send them out, 2 by 2. He ordered them to take nothing for their journey, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, just a staff, some sandals, and a single tunic. The encouraging thing, the good news in all of these different passages of Scripture for me is that my calling doesn't depend on me or my talent, my gifts. And the measure of my life is not my effectiveness or my power, but my faithfulness, my willingness to simply trust, to stand, to go, and to speak the truth as I hear it and understand it within me. It reminds me of that quote from Václav Havel, which we use here from time to time. It is I who must begin, here and now, right where I am, not excusing myself by saying that things would be easier elsewhere. You know, before he became the first president of the Czech Republic, Havel was a playwright who became a leading political dissident for over 20 years in Soviet-controlled Czechoslovakia. And during that time, he was banned from working in the theater, but continued to write dissident essays and plays, even though he was under constant surveillance, arrested multiple times, and spent years in prison. In 1979, Havel wrote, "We never decided to become dissidents. We have been transformed into them without quite knowing how. Sometimes we ended up in prison without precisely knowing how. We simply went ahead and did certain things that we felt we ought to do and that seemed decent to do, nothing more nor less." We never decided to become dissidents. I think the same thing can be said about most of the biblical prophets. I mean, Moses was a fugitive and a sheep herder when God called him to go to Egypt to challenge the power of Pharaoh. "Why me?" Moses asked. "I have never been eloquent, not in the past and not now. I am slow of speech." Amos was a shepherd too, and a dresser of sycamore trees, essentially a migrant farm laborer who tended the fruit of what was known as the poor man's fig tree in the ancient Middle East. Apparently, on this tree there was a little fruit, but for it to mature, somebody had to go and poke a hole in the skin of the fruit. So there were these poorly paid migrant laborers who did that. They climbed the trees and poke a hole in the fruit so that it would mature, and that became the poor man's fig. Well, that's what Amos was doing before he became a prophet. Samuel and Jeremiah were just young boys when God called them, and Mary, of course, was an unknown teenaged girl from the village of Nazareth. Ezekiel fell on his face, as we just heard, after seeing a vision of the holy, unable to stand on his own. And Elijah, the greatest prophet of all in the Hebrew Scriptures, got to a point where he ran away in fear, went into hiding, and prayed that he might die.